The deep dive is back, and today we are tackling a single case. But it's one of the most complex, just deeply unsettling criminal sagas in, I think, modern American history.
Yeah.
We're talking about the multi-state murder case involving Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell. You've almost certainly heard of it, probably under the heading of the Doomsday Mom murders.
And it's a case that has this almost unprecedented legal scope. I mean, when you really look at the totality of the evidence and all the charges, you realize this isn't just one crime.
Yeah.
It's a sequence of, highly coordinated, malicious acts. The legal labyrinth spans multiple killings. It involves two completely distinct state jurisdictions. We're talking Idaho and Arizona. And it's all unified by this extreme, really bizarre ideological belief system.
A system that prosecutors argued was the direct motivation for all the violence.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is to cut through years of sensational headlines and these incredibly complicated court filings. We have compiled a full factual summary of all the killings, the extensive legal proceedings, the convictions in both Idaho and Arizona, and maybe most importantly, we are laying out the final cumulative sentencing status for Lori Vallow Daybell and, of course, the fate of Chad Daybell.
What makes this so challenging to track, even for people who follow these things closely, is the way the prosecutors had to connect all these seemingly disparate events.
Right.
You have a killing that was at first ruled self-defense in Arizona. Then you have the suspicious death of a wife up in Idaho. And then the disappearance of two children in, a third location. They had to weave all of that into one coherent criminal conspiracy.
It's a huge task.
It is. The convictions required threading a very, very complex needle.
This truly feels less like a traditional murder trial and more like, the prosecution of an active criminal enterprise, one that was just spanning targets across state lines.
Yeah, and that ideological element you mentioned, that dark, apocalyptic belief system, in many ways, that was the engine driving this whole staggering scope of violence.
And that chronological map, which we're about to lay out, that is really the key. I mean, when you track the deaths and the disappearances one by one,
you see it.
You see how rapidly the danger just escalated once Lori and Chad's relationship formed and their specific belief system really solidified.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to chronologically map the four major incidents, the deaths and the attempted murder. We'll analyze the prosecution's unsettling motive, detail the convictions for both Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, and finally, summarize those final cumulative sentences that really defined Lori's fate forever across two state systems.
Let's do it.
So the legal chain of events that really culminates in these convictions, it starts to accelerate in 2019. The pivotal move, the sort of geographic shift in the story, is Lori Vallow's relocation to Idaho. She moved there with her two youngest children. There was Tylee Ryan, her teenage daughter, who was about 16, and her adopted son, Joshua J.J. Vallow, who was 7 and had special needs.
And she made that move specifically to be near Chad Daybell. He was her boyfriend at the time, and he lived in this rural part of Idaho. But to really understand the full conspiracy, we have to rewind just a little bit. Because that life change in 2019, it was immediately preceded by a really violent, defining moment back in Chandler, Arizona, earlier that same year.
Right, and that's the death of his fourth husband, Charles Vallow. This one incident, which was initially seen as completely isolated, it's the critical thread that allows the Arizona legal system to pull Lori back into court years later.
The initial details here are so crucial. So in July 2019, Charles Vallow was killed. The person who shot him was Lori's brother, Alex Cox.
Right.
And authorities at the time, they were presented with a claim of self-defense. The story was that Charles had become violent and Alex Cox intervened to protect his sister.
And the local authorities, they bought it.
They did. They accepted this initial explanation, which meant the case was essentially closed, or at least paused, for years. And this is what sets up the entire multi-state labyrinth. Because what was ruled a defensive killing in 2019 eventually becomes the blueprint for a cold-blooded conspiracy years later.
It effectively put law enforcement in Arizona temporarily off the scent, right?
Yeah.
It gave Lori and Alex Cox time to coordinate, to solidify their stories. It let Lori complete her move to Idaho without any immediate legal trouble.
Exactly. It was the first act of violence to eliminate an obstacle. And because of that self-defense ruling, it must have felt like they got away with it.
Which probably emboldened them for whatever came next.
I think so. Lori was free to join Chad Daybell.
And then, unfortunately, this is when the tragedy really enters the public consciousness. Tylee and JJ vanish, basically right after the move. They were last definitively seen in September of 2019.
Yeah, Tylee was last seen on a family trip to Yellowstone, and JJ was last seen just days later at his school.
The deceptive aspect of this whole vanishing act is what just compounds the horror.
Oh, absolutely. They vanish in September 2019, their remains. They're not tragically discovered until June of 2020. That is a massive gap.
9 months.
9 months. And during that time, Lori and Chad offered zero credible information about where they were. They maintained all these different lies to family members, to the authorities, and, most damningly, they just carried on with their lives.
As if nothing happened.
As if nothing happened. The children's grandmother was repeatedly told they were safe or they were with someone else, all while they were dead.
And right in the middle of that 9-month period, another suspicious death occurs. In October 2019, Tammy Daybell, Chad Daybell's first wife.
And Tammy's death initially amplified all the alarm bells for anyone who was looking closely at this group. She died suddenly, and her death was initially attributed to natural causes.
Despite her being relatively young and in good health.
Right. But what truly alerted investigators to a dangerous pattern was the sheer timeline shock of what happened right after.
Lori and Chad got married.
Just 2 weeks after Tammy's death, that rapid succession. Charles in Arizona, the children gone, and now Tammy. All connected to this one couple, and all initially brushed off as either natural causes or self-defense. It forced investigators to take a much broader, much more skeptical view of the whole situation.
So they had to connect the dots.
Precisely. And that's why, when the children were officially reported missing and the investigation really ramped up, authorities realized they needed to re-examine Tammy's death. So they exhumed her body.
And the autopsy found.
The subsequent autopsy found that her death was not natural. It was the result of asphyxiation. And this confirmed all of the investigators' suspicions, and crucially, it allowed prosecutors to officially link Tammy's killing to the broader criminal conspiracy that Lori and Chad were operating under.
So let's just recap that timeline because it's terrifying. We have Charles Vallow eliminated in July 2019. The children are gone by the end of September. And Tammy Daybell is eliminated in October.
All in the space of 4 months.
4 months. 4 people targeted, which allows Lori and Chad to quickly marry, ostensibly without any interference. That pattern it's just terrifying in its efficiency.
It really speaks to a shared, systematic intention to clear the way for their future life together. A life that, according to the prosecution, was driven entirely by their extreme shared religious ideology.
And that ideology is the absolute core of this case. Without it, the killings seem almost like random acts of domestic violence. With it, the prosecution built a motive that turned their own family members into targets under this spiritual pretext.
The prosecution argued very successfully in both Idaho and Arizona that this belief system was not some sideline eccentricity. It was the direct operational blueprint for their crimes. It was the legal underpinning they used to prove criminal intent or mens rea.
Wait, hold on. Before we dive into the beliefs themselves, let's stop and clarify that for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Legally, how difficult is it to use someone's internal religious belief as the central motive for a murder case? Doesn't that risk stepping into constitutional issues about freedom of religion?
That is an excellent question, and it really highlights the genius and the risk of the prosecution's strategy. Mens rea is just the legal term for a guilty mind. It's the criminal intent necessary to prove a crime was committed knowingly.
Okay.
So in a typical murder case, mens rea is malice, or premeditation, or the intent to kill. Now, the defense could have argued, and they often tried to, that Lori and Chad were delusional and maybe deserved a mental health defense.
But they didn't know what they were doing was wrong.
Exactly. However, the prosecution successfully framed the beliefs not as a delusion that negated their intent, but as a framework that defined and rationalized the intent. They weren't arguing Lori believed in doomsday. They were arguing that she deliberately and consciously used that belief system to categorize her family as dark spirits or zombies that needed to be eliminated.
Which proves premeditation and malice.
Exactly. And this avoided a constitutional challenge because they weren't prosecuting the belief itself. They were prosecuting the actions that were driven by the belief.
That is a really critical distinction. It makes the belief system an aggravating factor, not a mitigating one. So what were the specific bizarre contents of this ideology that they presented to the court?
The details were, they were deeply unsettling. Chad Daybell identified himself as a prophet and Lori Vallow as this divine counterpart. They created a complex hierarchy of spiritual status. And central to their motive was this idea that certain individuals could be spiritually possessed by dark spirits or become zombies.
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 Huh.
And these possessed people were no longer the loved ones they once were. And the only way to save their souls or to save the world was through their physical removal, their death.
And the prosecution's argument was that Charles Vallow, Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, and J.J. Vallow were all put into this category. They were labeled spiritually dark or zombies.
Precisely. This narrative allowed them to justify these horrific, calculated actions by redefining them as necessary spiritual missions. I mean, testimony showed they were waiting for the death of the physical body to allow the dark spirit to leave, which effectively served as their permission slip for murder.
And they had evidence of this.
Oh, yeah. The evidence included text messages, recorded conversations where they would discuss the spiritual status of their victims. For example, the focus on J.J. Vallow, a child with severe autism, was particularly chilling.
Mm-hmm.
Testimony revealed that Lori saw him as increasingly difficult and, therefore, potentially possessed. Chad had allegedly rated people on a dark light scale, and missing persons investigation and instantly initiated a capital murder case. The forensic findings themselves were integral to proving malice and intent beyond just the belief system.
Can you tell us about the evidence that was provided by the condition of the remains?
The evidence was devastating. Tylee Ryan's remains were found dismembered and burned. They were scattered in a fire pit area on the property. The state of her remains indicated this calculated, violent effort to destroy and hide the body, which speaks directly to covering up a premeditated murder.
And J.J.?
J.J. Vallow was found buried nearby, wrapped in plastic sheeting and duct tape. Specifically, his hands and his feet were bound with duct tape.
Oh, my God.
The fact that a 7-year-old child was physically restrained and then wrapped so meticulously in plastic and duct tape before burial, that directly countered any possible defense claims of, accidental death or sudden self-defense.
It's proof of planning.
It is. This physical evidence, combined with all the extreme ideological communications, allowed the prosecution to tie the deliberate planning to the horrific execution of the crimes. The sheer brutality locked in the necessary evidence for a murder conviction.
So with that physical evidence confirming the murders of Tylee and J.J. and the reclassification of Tammy Daybell's death as a homicide, the focus shifted entirely to the Idaho criminal proceedings.
Right.
These were the primary, highest-profile cases because they dealt with the direct homicides on Idaho's soil.
And these trials were just monumental undertakings. The prosecution's task was really twofold. They had to prove Lori and Chad were complicit in the direct murder of the children, and they had to prove they conspired to murder Tammy Daybell. They had to make sure the jury understood that the belief system was a motive, not an excuse.
Let's start with Lori Vallow Daybell's Idaho verdict. That came down in May of 2023. What was the exact outcome?
Lori was convicted on all the major counts she faced in Idaho, so that included 2 counts of first-degree murder for her children, Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow. And critically, she was also convicted of conspiracy to commit the first-degree murder of Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell. The jury completely accepted the prosecution's argument that she was an active participant in the planning and the execution of all 3 of those deaths.
And the sentence she received, it reflected the zero-tolerance stance of the court.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lori Vallow Daybell was handed multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole.
So no chance of getting out.
None. While the death penalty had initially been on the table, the state chose not to pursue it in her specific trial. But the use of consecutive sentencing, meaning one sentence has to be fully completed before the next one even begins, that meant she would never, under any circumstances, be released.
Now, her co-conspirator, Chad Daybell, he faced very similar charges related to the children's murders and Tammy's murder. His verdict came a year later, June 2024, and it resulted in a dramatically different sentence.
It did. Chad Daybell was also convicted of the murders of Tylee, J.J., and Tammy Daybell. The major difference came during the penalty phase. His jury recommended, and the judge subsequently imposed, the death sentence.
Wow.
And this is enormously significant. He became one of the very few individuals on death row in Idaho.
So why the distinction? They were both convicted of the same 3 murders. Why did Chad receive death while Lori got life without parole? This is a key legal insight that you, listening, really need to understand.
This contrast is where the law really focuses on individual actions and specific aggravating factors. So while both were found guilty of conspiracy and murder, Chad's case carried these unique aggravating circumstances that weighed very heavily on the jury and the judge.
Such as?
Well, first, the evidence suggested Chad was the one who physically carried out or at least facilitated the disposal and burial of the bodies. The children's remains were found on his property.
That's a huge factor.
It is. For Tylee, the evidence of the burning and dismemberment on his land was a critical factor. For JJ, he was present and directly involved in the burial. This proximity to the physical, malicious act of hiding the evidence and destroying the remains, that likely factored into the jury's calculation of depravity.
So Chad had a more demonstrable, hands-on role in the finality of the crime and the just heinous nature of the disposal. And that's a common aggravating factor in capital cases.
Precisely. And additionally, the prosecution, particularly in Chad's trial, may have focused more on his role as the ideological leader, the prophet, who provided the dangerous theological justification that ultimately led Lori, his co-conspirator, to agree to the murders.
So he was the architect of the motive.
In a way, yes. By contrast, while Lori was undeniably the children's mother and deeply complicit, some factors might have worked against the death penalty in her case. For instance, the fact that the actual disposal of the bodies appears to have been carried out by the men in the conspiracy, Chad and her deceased brother Alex Cox. This difference in specific aggravating factors allowed two different juries, examining very similar facts in separate trials, to reach different conclusions on the ultimate penalty.
And following her conviction, Lori immediately filed appeals in Idaho. What's the substance of those initial challenges? What are they arguing?
Her team is contesting procedural and constitutional rulings from her trial. A key area that gets flagged in almost every high-profile, complex case is this denial of counsel issue.
Okay.
This often refers to claims that her Sixth Amendment rights were violated. Maybe it's related to the court's handling of her access to legal representation, or claims about how effective her defense counsel was throughout the very lengthy proceedings.
So just so we're clear, when we talk about denial of counsel, they aren't arguing she didn't have a lawyer. They're arguing the lawyer was somehow ineffective or that the court interfered with her ability to mount a proper defense.
That's the translation for you, yes. They are arguing the process was flawed, not that the facts are wrong. And while Lori's convictions and her life sentences stand pending the outcome of these appeals, the burden of proof for overturning a conviction of this magnitude, especially given the weight of the physical and testimonial evidence, is astronomically high.
So it's a long shot.
It is. These appeals, while they're necessary to exhaust all legal remedies, they typically focus on minor procedural flaws rather than any kind of factual innocence.
Okay, so if the Idaho convictions addressed the central tragedies, the children and Tammy Daybell, the Arizona prosecutions are what truly demonstrated the breadth of Lori Vallow Daybell's criminal ambition. And they sealed her legal fate with absolute certainty.
Exactly.
This is where it gets really interesting because the legal process becomes this fascinating challenge.
It does. This transition highlights the immense complexity of prosecuting a single conspiracy across state lines. The Arizona legal system had separate and distinct jurisdiction to deal with crimes committed in Maricopa County, specifically the death of Charles Vallow and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. And these were not lesser charges. They were completely distinct battles focusing entirely on the planning phase of her criminal enterprise.
So the Charles Vallow conspiracy trial, that wrapped up in April of 2025. As we mentioned, Charles's killing was initially ruled self-defense by Alex Cox back in 2019. How did the Arizona prosecution pivot years later to secure a conspiracy conviction against Lori?
This required some real legal surgery. The prosecution had to shift entirely away from the physical act of the shooting itself and focus exclusively on the planning, the communication, and the financial motivation that happened before it. And the jury ultimately found her guilty of conspiring with her brother, Alex Cox, to murder Charles Vallow.
What was the evidence?
The evidence presented by prosecutors in Arizona was incredibly detailed. They focused on what they called pattern of life evidence. They showed that prior to Charles's death, Lori had taken steps to financially benefit from his demise, specifically trying to access his life insurance policy.
The classic motive.
The classic motive. They introduced evidence of constant communication between Lori and Alex Cox in the days and hours leading up to the incident, indicating a coordinated plan to lure Charles to the location and create the conditions necessary for his death to be perceived as self-defense.
So they proved that Lori and Alex had a shared, premeditated intention to eliminate Charles, even if Alex Cox was the one who pulled the trigger. This effectively turned a self-defense case into a successful prosecution of a conspiracy years after the fact.
It's an important legal precedent. The success hinged on proving that the malice originated with Lori Vallow and was communicated to Cox, making that self-defense ruling nothing more than a cover story that was executed as part of the conspiracy.
And then the very next month, June 2025, she faced another conspiracy charge in Arizona, this time related to Brandon Boudreaux. This target feels a little more removed from the immediate Daybell circle. So who was Boudreaux and what was the nature of that crime?
Brandon Boudreaux was the ex-husband of Lori's niece, Melanie Pawlowski, who was also deeply involved in this apocalyptic belief system. The connection is rooted in the fact that Boudreaux was considered an obstacle.
Another dark individual.
Another dark individual who needed to be removed, perhaps because he was raising doubts about Lori's movement or her influence over his ex-wife.
And what was the crime itself?
The crime was chilling. In October 2019, this is just before Tammy Daybell's death, Brandon Boudreaux was driving home in Gilbert, Arizona, when a shooter in a Jeep attempted to kill him.
A drive-by shooting.
Essentially, yes. This shooter fired multiple rounds into his vehicle, and while he was unharmed, the attack was deliberate. Prosecutors were able to tie that Jeep to Alex Cox and, crucially, tie Lori Vallow to the planning of the attack.
So she was found guilty of conspiracy to commit attempted murder. This means the court concluded she actively participated in the planning and preparation of the attack on Boudreaux. It demonstrates a clear intention to eliminate targets beyond even her immediate family.
It solidified the prosecution's central thesis. This was not a localized emotional response to one person. This was a sprawling criminal enterprise spanning multiple targets, planned over a sustained period, and executed across state lines. It just demonstrated a willingness to use systematic violence against anyone who is deemed a spiritual or practical threat.
We have to also touch on a truly unusual legal tactic that Lori Vallow Daybell employed during these Arizona trials. She chose to represent herself at various points. I mean, that is an incredibly high-stakes, risky decision.
It is almost unheard of in capital or life sentence cases, which just underscores the unusual nature of this defendant. Lori exercised her constitutional right to self-representation or pro that inevitably influenced the courtroom dynamic and juror perception.
Okay, so while the Idaho sentences were a massive punishment, you're saying the Arizona sentences were the ultimate legal mechanism that ensured her permanent, inescapable incarceration. They close all possible avenues for any future release.
That's right.
Let's focus on that sentencing hearing itself. This was the culmination of years of legal work by two separate state teams. Lori was sentenced in Arizona on July 25, 2025 for both the Charles Vallow conspiracy and the Brandon Boudreaux conspiracy.
And on that date, Lori was sentenced to additional life sentences without the possibility of parole. Specifically, 1 life sentence for the Charles Vallow conspiracy conviction and 1 life sentence for the Brandon Boudreaux conspiracy conviction.
So that brings her total up to 3 life sentences from Idaho and 2 more from Arizona. 5 life sentences. That sounds definitive on its own, but the real, non-negotiable legal power lies in the judge's order about how those sentences must be served. This is the crucial detail for you, the listener, to grasp.
Absolutely. The critical detail is the consecutive order. The Arizona judge explicitly ordered these 2 new life sentences to be served consecutively to each other. That means she has to fully complete the first life sentence before she can legally even begin serving the second.
Okay.
But the truly decisive element is that the Arizona judge mandated they be served in addition to her existing Idaho life sentences. This means the sentences are stacked, life A, then life B, then life C, life D, and life E.
So for you listening, let's just break down the math on that. Why is consecutive the magic word that seals her fate compared to if they had been concurrent?
Well, if the sentences were concurrent, they would all be served at the same time. So theoretically, if a life sentence is commutable after, say, 30 years, and she had 4 concurrent life sentences, she would only serve 30 years and theoretically finish all of them at once.
Okay, I see.
But consecutive means they are stacked back to back. Since Lori was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, stacking them consecutively across multiple states just eliminates any theoretical legal window. The result is absolute. She is required to finish the first impossible sentence before starting the second impossible sentence, and so on. The legal intent is unmistakable. She will die in prison, and the courts have used every available legal tool to guarantee that outcome.
The judicial commentary from the Arizona judge was equally forceful, wasn't it? Ensuring that the intent behind the sentencing was clearly documented for any future appeals court.
It was. The judge's assessment was a powerful statement on the court's view of her threat to society. He stated that Lori Vallow Daybell's actions showed a blatant disregard for humanity. And furthermore, the judge explicitly noted that the sentences were intentionally structured to ensure she would never, under any circumstances, be free again. That judicial record is vital because it establishes intent to remove any possibility of release, which strengthens the consecutive order against any future challenges.
And beyond the prison time, were there any other penalties levied by the Arizona court?
Yes, the penalties were financial and also protective. In addition to the 5 stacked life sentences, she was ordered to pay significant financial restitution. We're talking fines totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover funeral costs, medical expenses, and legal fees incurred by the victim's family.
And protective.
The court also issued lifetime no-contact orders protecting various victims and family members, including Brandon Boudreaux and others connected to the conspiracy. This shields them from any future communication, harassment, or, God forbid, further attempts on their lives.
So she is officially locked in. But where is she physically located, and what is the status of these endless appeals?
Her current incarceration location remains the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. Despite the Arizona convictions and sentences, Idaho is her primary location because her initial first priority life sentences were handed down there. She's currently housed there while awaiting the resolution of her extensive appeal processes in both states.
So the legal machinery is still grinding away.
It is. In Idaho, her team continues to challenge the constitutional issues, specifically those denial of counsel claims we talked about. In Arizona, her post-conviction motions have included claims related to her health and various procedural claims about how the trial was conducted, specifically arguing that the court failed to properly handle certain elements of evidence or jury instruction.
But the key point remains that none of these efforts have resulted in any reversal. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the appeals process will likely be this prolonged, exhausting fight over procedural minutia rather than any real attempt to overturn the factual basis of the crimes.
That's the reality of these high-profile cases. When the evidence is this overwhelming, you have physical remains, you have a financial motive, you have volumes of communications detailing the motive, the appeals become focused on tiny technical missteps by the court or the prosecution. And while the legal system must allow for this exhaustive review, it is highly improbable that procedural claims will overturn a consensus verdict that's backed by consistent evidence across 2 state lines.
From the very beginning, driven by the faces of those missing children and that bizarre doomsday narrative, the Vallow Daybell case absolutely gripped the American public. It merged true crime, religious extremism, and just unimaginable domestic violence.
The media coverage has been massive and sustained, and it really speaks to the unique cocktail of elements present here. You have the tragedy of children killed by their own mother and stepfather, you have the inherently sensational element of an apocalyptic cult, and you have the intense legal drama of multi-state capital trials.
And this attention has manifested in just extensive ongoing coverage. Everything from daily trial reporting to documentaries and, deep dive podcasts like this that continue to track the legal fallout. The public fascination seems rooted in just trying to comprehend how people reach a point where such destructive, violent beliefs supersede fundamental human morality.
The case really serves as a profound, dark, cautionary tale about the intersection of extreme internal ideology and domestic life. It forced many observers to confront the unsettling question of what happens when private, radicalized beliefs become the engine for systematic public harm against vulnerable family members.
So, considering the successful prosecution across multiple jurisdictions, what does this all mean when we look at the totality of the convictions and the sentences for Lori Vallow Daybell?
The final legal status reflects a complete accountability. It's not just for the individual murders of Tylee and JJ, but for what you could call the broader pattern of harm that was inflicted across multiple years and states. The Arizona convictions covering the Charles Vallow conspiracy and the Brandon Boudreaux attempted murder conspiracy were essential for that.
They were.
They ensured that the court addressed the totality of the criminal conspiracy, not just the most tragic outcome in Idaho. Prosecutors managed to hold her accountable for an entire series of malice-driven acts.
It is a profound example of how justice systems, despite the challenges of state boundaries and jurisdictional differences, can coordinate effectively to pursue a comprehensive account of chronic, escalating criminal behavior.
Precisely. And that success in prosecuting a motive leads us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider, and it builds directly on the central role of that spiritually dark ideology. Considering the extreme internal belief system, the idea that family members were possessed or zombies was successfully used by the prosecution to prove premeditated malice. What are the long-term societal implications when radical internal worldviews intersect so violently with domestic life? And furthermore, how should society and the legal system best evolve to identify and respond to threats posed by individuals whose actions are entirely rationalized within an apocalyptic, violent framework that they genuinely believe is divine? It's a chilling thought that the very foundation of their worldview was the intent to destroy.
So, to quickly summarize the key takeaways from this incredibly complex deep dive, Lori Vallow Daybell now faces dual state convictions. In Idaho, she was convicted of the first-degree murders of her children, Tylee and JJ, and the conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell.
And in Arizona, she was convicted of 2 separate conspiracies. One for the murder of Charles Vallow, and one for the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. The crucial legal point that ensures her permanent incarceration is the consecutive nature of her 5 stacked life sentences without parole, which she is currently serving at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center despite her ongoing procedural appeals.
Thank you for providing the extensive sources that allowed us to navigate this legal labyrinth. We hope this comprehensive breakdown helps you understand the full scope and the definitive legal outcomes of the Vallow Daybell case.